Hey, good morning. It's really great to share your stories with you like that. Thanks for the permission to be gone the last couple of weeks. I understand that Tim was very well received, and so thank you for that. And then Dr. Bruner, for what it's worth, so Dr. Bruner, he's on a year-long sabbatical right now, and he started his sabbatical by getting on the airplane and flying to Helena to spend a week here with you all. So that's what you mean to him. He flew in at midnight on a Friday, which friends don't fly into cities at midnight, right? That's part of what I learned, but he's a friend. But that's a brutal time to pick somebody up at the airport. And then he flew out last Thursday. He was jonesing a little bit that we didn't tell him about Ailes being the next day. Plus, he would have been perfectly adapted because he lives in Portland. But nonetheless, one of the fun things to talk with him about was he was processing with us at one point what he was going to talk about and the feminine God idea that he wanted to bring to the table last weekend. And it was actually really fun to go like, dude, Dr. Bruner, you're not going to make people mad, because if they do get mad, then they left a long time ago because they were mad about something else. And so he felt really safe, and it was just a great place for him, and I gather that you all enjoyed that too, so thank you for that. Thanks too for Ailes, just kind of anecdotally and piggybacking off of what Hannah said. Every year as we move towards Ailes, it's kind of like moving towards summer camp. Like, seriously, are we going to do this again? Because it's fun, but it's also a ton of work. And yet, for me, the day of is always this. I mean, the weather was brutal this year, but nonetheless, what was a lot of fun was just the connections with people, like this, becoming this same group of people, not the same, but, Christian and Greg and Michael and David and Nick and all these people who were there at 8:30 in the morning, and then just this whole day. My dad comes down and helps that day. Like, it's the only time he comes to Helena all year. Not totally, but I don't know what that says. He comes for Ailes. Anyway, it's great. And he works his butt off, so that's really fun. And then those of you who stay and tear down and the serving, and those of you at the front gates, you had the hardest job this year. Because, it was raining, but if we were pulling a tap handle, it was cold. But some of you guys were just drenched as you were taking tickets. So thank you for that. Did you see Scott tear down? It's becoming one of my highlights of the Ailes event. You all know Scott Pertinga, who's 6'50", and he does this thing, like, because if a normal person was tearing down, they would just, we have all those wine barrels, you just turn them on their side and kick them towards the trailer. That's what the rest of us do. But Scott, several years running now, he picks them up like Donkey Kong, or like Mario, I guess. Donkey Kong kicks them, right? But he picks them up and puts them over his head and walks them to the trailer. But this year we had several of them that had that big sign structure. So I watched him on several occasions like pick one up, and he was like trying to get balance, and it took him like 4 times. And then someone this morning was telling me that she said, I think it was Carla. She's like, I saw that guy at first pick the barrels up, walking with them over his head, and she said, I thought to myself, I hope he's with us. No one's going to stop him if he's stealing that barrel. It'd just be like, how many would you like, sir? Just take them all. But I really wanted to talk to him this morning. I think are you here somewhere, Scott? I think he's tearing. Oh, yeah, where are you? Yeah, everybody, there's Scott right there. the man, the myth, the legend, who will take care of you at the ER if you drop a barrel on your head. So that's the irony of all that. Okay, so a couple other things. So remember, next week we're not here. Memorial Day weekend, the council just opted to take that one off. We're really grateful for that. Gives the staff a chance to zoom out and work on like non-tyranny of the urgent. In fact, one of the things, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but the Grand Street gave us a bunch of that cedar that was up here for the last stage. So David Harris, this brilliant contractor, tomorrow and Tuesday, he and I and a group of people, Mike from the youth build stuff, they're going to frame up that back wall 326 and hang that cedar across that. So that'll be lots of fun. Anyway, so we won't be here next Sunday. And then on the 2nd, June 2nd, we're starting a brand new series called Borrowed Breath. I want to get into a conversation about the Holy Spirit. A lot of the spiritual direction stuff provoked that in me. But to be honest with you, we're very purposely not calling it the Holy Spirit. Not that we're afraid of that, but there's just a lot of artifacts that come with the Spirit of God in the text. And part of what we want to do is peel away some of those preconceived notions and religious layers and just ask, like, what is the Spirit of God in the text, and how do we have a healthy relationship there? So that starts the 2nd. This morning, what I want to do is, I've known for months this would be a one-off week. We're not in a series. And there's a book that I've referenced before, but I read several months ago, written by a guy named Jonathan Narrate, called Learning to Speak God from Scratch. And in there, he asks some pretty good questions that I found to be pretty challenging. And I think maybe even as we head towards summer and we have different rhythms, and some of you will be gone more than others, or more than normal, and just we'll be here, but at the same time, go camping, do your thing. I think this might be the perfect way to kick into summer, because it begs us to ask this question. And it's really this: how important is it to you that you're having meaningful spiritual conversations? Now, I want to be careful there, because I don't mean this in the leveraged, authoritative, what does the Bible say? What does God say? What would your parents say? What would that authority person that you're living in their shadow say? I mean in the economy of your life. How important is it to you that a piece of the puzzle is having meaningful dialogue about God and spiritual things? As you think about the person you're trying to become, the relationships you're trying to have, the connection spiritually that you hope to have and to grow, as you figure out the math, like the formula of the whole thing and what your strategic plan is to get there, how much a part of the plan are meaningful spiritual conversations? And here's why I think that's important. Because around Narrate, there's lots of things that normal churches do that we don't do. Lots of them have X, Y, and Z class and all these small groups. And we're not saying we don't value any of those things, but really our strategy is really simple. It's, hey, we're going to gather, and what we hope to do is provoke conversations that spill out into your dorm rooms or into your apartment or into your house and into your workplace and into your relationships and into your marriage and into your parenting. And that's the plan aside from this. And so something that's been bugging me for a few years on a personal level has been, okay, so we stand here every week. I stand here every week and go, hey, we're not trying to tell you what to think. We're just trying to ask questions. Hey, we're not just trying to give you some kind of curriculum. We're just trying to provoke discussion and elicit wonder and those different things. But what I've been observing about myself for the last several years is I'm not actually doing it, at least not very effectively. Even in my own work week one-on-ones, I'm catching myself getting more and more comfortable at even creating spiritual conversation. Now, for my part, I've assumed for years that was me, that was my space, that was my upbringing. I try to be sensitive to the fact that my poor kids sit here and listen to me on Sundays, and so I'm trying not to be that guy in my home and model things, but not force things. There's lots of variables in play for me. I'm not convinced all of them are right or wrong. It just is what it is. But what happened to me recently was I bumped into this Jonathan Narrate book. And he actually grabbed that tension and began to expose this idea. In fact, he talks a lot about lost languages, that there are many languages over time that disappear, and that what he's saying is that meaningful God talk is beginning to slip away, and if we're not careful, may disappear entirely outside of this context. So what he did is he commissioned the Barna Group. You may be familiar with them. They do a lot of Christian research in the United States, pretty reputable organization, to ask some questions. And here's some of the data they got. They asked people, are you having spiritual conversations? 20% of those, according to their research, 20% said never. Doesn't mean they don't go to church, just means when they leave a place like this, there's never a conversation. 29% said, 1 or 2 times a year. Another 29% said, 5 or 6 times per year. And I don't know where the missing percents are, but the only other one they give us is 13%. 13% of people they asked are having at least one spiritual conversation a week. Now, again, I'm not trying to leverage this against you or make you feel poorly, just trying to ask the question. Because what happens in life is we set off in a direction, and then school happens, and mortgages happen, and work happens, and travel sports happen, and if we're not careful, we get decades down the road and go, wait a minute, I didn't know I was on this path. How important in the economy of your spiritual life are these spiritual conversations? See, here's what I've been learning about myself in this process, and I know I bore you with these self-absorbed details all the time, but I was raised in what I would call a nominally Catholic home, and I think more and more what I mean by that is, we went to church occasionally, we prayed the Hail Mary and the Our Father before bed most nights, but there was zero spiritual conversation. Then at 17, I was introduced to this great church in Billings. You've all met Stan Simmons, the founding pastor, and for a couple years, I sat in the back row of this massive mega church and enjoyed the music and enjoyed the messages and wondered where the crucifix was and just mostly just kind of took it all in. About 6 months after graduating high school, I had my own crisis moment where I think I acted upon what I'd been learning, which was just this invitation like, hey, Adam, people who follow God have these decisive points in their life where they make decisions to do so, and so that, as best I can tell, is what I did in the middle of the night when I was 19 years old. The next day, I was introduced to a guy named Fred Nelson, who at the time was a 50-something insurance salesman. He had a large book of business, and part of what he had done was he programmed into his workday every morning and every afternoon, he programmed a half an hour where he just hung out with people like me and talked about Jesus and the Bible and God and marriage, and he had a very good reputation for his knowledge in those things. And literally the next day I met Fred. And from that point until I moved to Helena 10 years later, Fred and I, every other week, went for a walk. Now, initially, it was kind of a little more formal, and he was teaching me how to read good non-Christian or nonfiction books and how to grow in that regard. He taught me how to study the scriptures, which still kind of speaks to my bias, because I remember the first thing he ever said. He said, Adam, John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. 2 weeks from now, I want you to bring me 50 questions from that verse. And so even then, he was modeling for me that it's about the questions, not about the answers. But mostly what we did over those 10 years was we went for walks. Whether it was 10 below, whether it was 110 degrees, we just went for walks. I remember processing whether or not to ask Teresa to marry me with him. I remember processing whether or not to go back to college. We were processing kids. It just, life-on-life stuff happened. My point is this: what I'm realizing is, for whatever it's worth to you, my own spiritual bias, my formation bias, is actually this. I value this. And I value it because for a couple years in my life, it changed my life. But to be honest with you, the other piece of the puzzle for me, and it's not to say these things don't work, but it wasn't a class, and it wasn't a curriculum, and it wasn't any of that stuff. The other piece of the puzzle for me that changed my life was the conversations that I was having with people like Fred, which would mean this: to whatever degree you're trusting me and us, that's really the only formula I have for you. And I think it creates this own self-auditing question of, like, are we leaning into that? And do you value that? And listen, I mean this honestly. Like, if what you need is a more formalized structure, there's great churches in town that I know will give that to you. But if what you're doing is looking for the organic, I'm with you. We're a part of the same party. The catch is, it leaves us with a lot of work to do to provoke the conversations and ask the questions. Now, I think we're in good company. This is just what we do. We read the Bible and find our bias, right? But when I read Jesus and about Jesus, I find my bent all over the text. Listen to Matthew 4:23, and there's a couple other places in the Gospels where we're given this culture. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. See, what that tells me is Jesus, he lived his life inside of synagogue. The sermon, if you will, this communal experience was a big piece of the puzzle for Jesus. And even in his ministry was a big piece of the puzzle. But I love the way Dallas Willard says it. Jesus lived his life inside of the synagogue, but he wasn't contained by it. So here's what stands out to me. When you think about the stuff that you know about Jesus as it relates to what he taught, what he valued, what he believed, why do you know that? Is it because of a podcast of a sermon that he gave? Is it because of of some kind of manuscript we have in the text of, oh yeah, when Jesus gave this sermon? See, quickly what comes to mind for me is really, if we're getting literal inside of a synagogue, as best I can tell, we've got one sermon. Like one time that I can find where he goes like, oh yeah, he taught from Isaiah, and this was all about the marginalized and the oppressed. Aside from that, why do we know Jesus' value of loving God, loving people? Why do we know his value of prayer and of temple and all the things that we know about what he taught? How do we know that? Because he ate meals. I remember Vern used to say to me, Adam, everybody has to eat, so you might as well just eat with somebody else. Because he went on walks, he went on road trips, he went fishing, he floated the Galilee, right? I mean, he lived a very, Scott McKnight says it this way, he lived a very he lived a very typical first century Jewish life. And he provoked conversation. Which brings me back to this question, how important is it to you that you're having these conversations? Now, those who did this research, they took the question to another level, and they asked those of us who attend church regularly. they asked this question, how often are you? And the answer they got was 13%. Now, we did our own little Slido, and this is anything but an exact science, but we did our own little poll this week. About 50 of you responded, and half of you said weekly. 30% said monthly, 13% said daily, and 9% said yearly at best. So we're doing better. But again, the question that I want to bring to the surface is how important is it? And if it is important, are we actually doing it? Now, there's another bit of research in Jonathan's book that he cites from the Positive Psychology Journal. And what they wanted to know was a little bit different. They wanted to know over the course of the last 5 or so hundred years, how has what we talk about changed? And they used that is it Ngram or that thing that Google has where they've compiled all this written material going all the way back to 1500, right up almost to the present time of all these magazine articles and journal articles and books and songs, and it just studies language. And one of the things you can do is you can go, okay, over the course of time, how has the use of this word changed, disappeared, gained in momentum, whatever. So they picked 50 terms that they said deal with moral virtue. Words like, go ahead to that next slide, words like mercy and wisdom and faith and sacrifice and honesty, righteousness, evil. What they found is in the last 100 years, 74% of the words they picked, the use has decreased. So even what we're talking about has changed. Humility words like modesty, down 52%. Compassion words like kindness, down 56%. Gratitude words like thankfulness, down 48%. Now again, ironically, just trying to provoke the conversation, but to ask this question. As you think about a person who's trying to become compassionate or humble or kind, how important is it that we find ourselves in situations where we're actually doing this stuff? I have a friend right now who's going through a pretty painful divorce, and I gotta say, just sitting across from him and listening to him talk about the way that he's trying to do this has personally been inspiring to go like, oh yeah, honesty matters. Kindness matters. Not gossiping, it really does change the temperature of a whole environment. Then they ask this question. They ask people, okay, so especially those who aren't having these conversations, why aren't you having them? Ignorance was 17%. And this is one of those like mark all that apply. So 17% of people are like, I'm just frankly not equipped. 23%, so a quarter of them said, just don't care. I just honestly don't think about spiritual things. But here is the one that stood out to me. Avoidance, 63% of them are just like hot potato, I wouldn't dare, I couldn't possibly, no way, ain't happening. And in fact, where Jonathan's book does a really good job is he identifies a whole bunch of words that we would probably do well to rethink. Question, how important is it to you? You know, one of the things that stands out to me with the avoidance thing is my early experience with spiritual direction, and I know I've talked a lot about that recently, but it's been a big piece of, I feel like, how God is shaping me, and I jumped into this program. I think in some part of the reason why I jumped into the spiritual direction program was just seeing, even in my work, I've started to lean back from spiritual conversation. I mean, part of planning a church is making yourself palatable, and I think part of what that caused me to do is go like, I don't want to weird people out, I just want to be normal, and so I've failed to have spiritual conversations. Well, spiritual direction, if you weren't here for the series, it really constitutes a few things. It's a space where you listen, or in the case of the directee, you get to talk, and the idea is that just in the process of sharing your experiences, just by being heard and having someone ask you good questions, you'll be able to identify God and thus discern what it looks like to follow him. And some of the best therapists practice a very similar thing. Well, in early September, I had to identify 3 people that I would meet with monthly. In fact, I'm still doing it even though class is over. And after the first round of that, Teresa and I think must have been a date night. I can still remember we were walking across the parking lot to Silver Star to grab dinner. And she asked me, she said, so how's that going? Something along those lines. And you know, obviously I'm a verbal processor, but I hadn't really thought about this until she asked. And here's what I caught myself saying to her. I said, here's what's been refreshing. Because I meet with people all the time and I enjoy meeting people all the time. But here was the piece that I was like, whoa, I didn't see that coming. I said, well, here's what I'm finding refreshing is the opportunity to sit across from somebody and listen to them talk about their spiritual experiences with God without any responsibility to filter it for accuracy has been wildly refreshing. And when I said that, I was like, whoa. Because see, spiritual direction, and it's not that there's not a place for teaching, please don't misunderstand me, but it operates on this premise that if somebody wants to talk about their spirituality, then on some level, God is involved in their life, and God was, using Bruner, God was before you got there, and God will be after you're gone. And thus, what you're doing is stewarding a moment. You're like sitting across from an artist, and you're not there to tell them what to paint. You're there to just listen to them and be attentive to them. And it makes me wonder, what if part of the issue here is we frankly just lack safe space to go, here's what I've been thinking. Here's what's been going on in me. What if what happens is there are these trigger words, and we hear them, and we're like, oh, yeah, no, not worth it. Because if I get vulnerable, and if I say what I'm thinking about that social issue, or if I actually have a conversation about what I'm thinking about that theological tenet, then you're going to call me a heretic. Then I'm going to offend you because I'm too conservative. Whatever that dynamic is. What if we're avoiding the conversation because there's landmines everywhere? And we're not even really sure how to take the next step. Question. What are the landmines for you? In fact, I threw up a new thing on Slido this morning if you're doing anything there and enjoy the interaction. What are the buzzwords for you? I mean, frankly, we're doing a series in June that's connected to that. Holy Spirit, I just shut down. Borrowed breath. Okay, I'll just create new language then. But what are the buzzwords for you that cause you to go like, yeah, I'd love to, but there's not enough hours in the day to actually have this conversation? For me, one of them is biblical, which I know is ironic. There was a time in my life where I loved the word, but at this point in my journey, I don't mean to make you be overly self-conscious, but I kind of loathe when someone says, yeah, but that's biblical. Because to me, it's a strong-armed statement that implies that any thinking person who reads the Bible comes to the same conclusion. And guess what? We have diversity in our own town of well-intentioned people reading the text and coming to different convictions. The other one for me, just by way of example, is the word sin, which I know is ironic. And I hope you understand me well enough to know that I genuinely believe that there's lots of great churches in this town, and we're not the right place for everybody, and different temperaments and all those different things. But I was walking across town recently, and I happened upon some marketing, and it said something like, rescuing people from a life of sin. And you know that thing you do when you give yourself a mini sermon, and then you don't realize you just did it? Like 10 minutes later, I realized whoa, and I actually thought I was going to get to do a series around our 10th anniversary on this word, but here I'm going to use it as an example as to what I mean. Because here's my thinking, and this is just be an example of I wonder if these are the conversations we're afraid to have. I would go this, hey, if by sin we mean that the primary tension in the text is that God is perfect, but I lied, therefore I'm imperfect, therefore I deserve hell, but if I believe Jesus died for me, then I can take on his imperfection, I'm out. I actually don't think that's the primary issue in the text. To me, and I'm grateful to N.T. Wright and Dr. Delamar for helping me with this, to me, sin is not primarily a moral issue. N.T. Wright calls it a second level. It's a second level issue, that the primary issue is idolatry. It's a vocational issue. That what if sin is God made you to put him on display. God made you to put God on display. You have a role to play. And when you lie, you compromise your ability to be who God has called you to be and to reflect God the way God is. And therefore, we're under this cloud of evil and brokenness, and Jesus conquered that. Listen to the way Paul talks about it in Romans, which is often, it's the Romans road, right? It's the you lied, therefore you deserve hell, therefore Jesus solved it. But watch this. For although they knew God, this is early in Paul's development, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and look at the tension, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. It's an idolatry issue. It's a misplacing the purposes for your life issue. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. So it's like stage 2 is the immoral stuff. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie. and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator, who was forever praised. Amen. What if sin isn't first and foremost a moral covenant violation, but a vocational covenant violation? And really, it's all the same thing. We're giving our lives not to God and God's purposes, but to some other things. Now, I'm not asking you to agree. I understand there's a danger because I just wedged a really big conversation in the midst of another one. But if nothing else, what I'm trying to illustrate, what if the reason we're caught up talking about sports and all kinds of other trivial stuff is because that's the level of depth we would have to go to really have these conversations, and it's scary. I think if you're someone who's been following Jesus for decades, especially if you're a parent, I think this ought to serve as a warning. Like, maybe those conversations with your kids, even adult kids, aren't happening, not because there's not stuff happening up here for them, but because they already know what you believe. And frankly, they don't believe the same thing as you do. And thus, it's terrifying. They respect you so much, and yet they can't think that way anymore. You know, in spiritual direction, the great directors, if a directee shows up and says, yeah, I didn't have time to pray this month, you know what the seasoned directors say in response to that? This is part of what I'm learning. And excuse the phrase, but I think it's most appropriate here. You know what the seasoned director says to the person who's like, yeah, I was too busy to pray? You know what they say? They say, BS. The issue isn't busyness. The issue is the real heat, the real tension, the real pain, the real joy. It's over here, and you don't feel safe to talk to God about it. Like, if we're willing to openly dialogue, they would say, with God on the real stuff, then prayer will flow naturally. And thus, a failure to pray, they would say, is really, you're just bifurcating your life and you're not really bringing the heat to the conversation. What if that, in some sense, perfectly explains what's going on in spiritual dialogue? And I think there's other things like iPhones and alcohol and lots of other things that, if we're not careful, just shut down our ability to have meaningful conversation. But what if the big one is there's stuff? And to be honest with you, if I said this out loud, I don't even know if you would think of me as a Christian anymore. Or to be honest with me, if I said this out loud, I think you would think I'm some kind of tyrannical, crazy person who still lives in the 17th century, and I don't want you to think that either. And so, let's talk about the weather. Which brings me to this question. How important is it to you, to the person you're trying to be, to the formation you're trying to bring into your home, to the relationships and friendships you want to have, how important is it to you that conversation is happening? And what if in the midst of getting there, we just have to learn to go like, hold on. You already know what you think. So maybe even do that little like, why don't you talk about what you think the Bible is for 10 minutes, and then I'll talk about what I think the Bible is for 10 minutes, and then maybe we can actually have a conversation that's more than hurtful. You know, there's this phrase in Deuteronomy, and we'll end here, or this statement, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a spot in the Jewish scriptures that is more meaningful to them in their thinking about the Torah. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. So that much is clear, right? I mean, even Jesus jumped on top of that. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Watch this. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates. Now, we can all probably picture Jewish men in particular with those square boxes on their head and the things on their doors, all in an attempt to what? To keep front and center meaningful spiritual conversation. Why? Because as a people who later would be trying to make sense of what it means to follow God without a temple, they understood synagogue and everyday conversation. Listen, I don't know where you're at in your journey. I know that to follow Jesus, we often hit these intersections where we decide things. Maybe for you, today was one of those by even coming to church and you haven't been here for a long time. Maybe you're through this spot where you're ready to follow Jesus with a greater level of decisiveness. maybe you're at this spot this morning where you're realizing like, yeah, I think I've just gotten kind of lazy or kind of scared. Maybe I need to turn the TV off a little bit more. Whatever that looks like, just want to create a space for you to think about how important is it to you that you're having spiritual conversation, and maybe what needs to change if you're to get there. So I'd like to pray. Teresa and the band will lead us through one more song. God, thanks, Lord, that you made us social and relational creatures. Thanks, God, that I'm just grateful, God, that you didn't give us a chip to download into our being, but that you invite us to live a life by which we learn about you and wisdom. And God, I'm just operating on the assumption that people wouldn't have carved this space out of their life if there wasn't this desire for more of you, that in a culture that sees less and less of a place for this, God, that they've already made a statement about their desires for you and health and character and growth. And God, as we move into summer and in some sense we spend more time together, in another sense things are more disruptive, would you maybe teach us or even reteach us how to step into the joy of having meaningful spiritual dialogue? Not excessively, not even oppressively, but just genuinely and honestly. We love you, God. Amen.
So here at Narrate, we gather and we scatter. And so we gather here on Sunday mornings at Grand Street, and we have really fantastic teams that work hard to pull off gatherings every Sunday. And then we scatter. We like to get into our community and serve people where they're at. So we did a lot of scattering this past weekend. We had Ales for Trails down at Pioneer Park on Friday, and it was a little cold and a little wet, but didn't seem to slow most people down. So it takes about 150 volunteers every year to make Ales happen just on the day of at the park. That's set up, tear down, pouring beer, checking IDs, putting on wristbands, stamping hands, all that sort of stuff, not to mention the team that meets year-round to plan the event. So if you were a part of making that happen, gosh, thank you so much. It was a lot of fun. Like I said, it was a little wet, but we made it through. And so what else did I say about Ales? Oh, yeah. So we're not sure about the final number yet. Doris will need a couple weeks to kind of go through invoices and make sure everything's up to date. So we'll have a final number, fundraising number for you, which is going towards the Mount Helen. No, I just need a second. All my words are tangled up this morning. All the proceeds from Ales are going towards the Ridgeline Trailhead and the Helena Trail Rider, so hopefully in a couple weeks we'll have that final amount for you. And then on Saturday, a group went to the YWCA, which is right down the street, and we love going down there. They're great. So we helped to redo and repaint their downstairs kind of kids area. It was a kind of a dark mauve color, and so we're brightening that up and helping them out down there. So it was a lot of fun. Thanks if you were a part of making that happen. There was a lot of scattering this weekend, so thank you if you were a part of either of those events. All right, that being said, ushers, you may come forward with the offering.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.